Hello, Houston. We were talking last time in our journey through Introduction to Cognitive Psychology about language and specifically how we comprehend it. Finished in a bit of a rush, and so I wanted to just remind you of where we were. We had been looking at the various distinctive properties that language exhibits, and we had gotten into the dynamic feature of it, the use feature, and I was describing basically what I'm going to call a linguistic hierarchy. That is a series of levels at which we can actually analyze language products. And that would include looking at things like phonemes, which are basically the smallest unit of language that we look at. Okay, and so we'll define it essentially in terms, first of all, of a phone. That is, we have 26 letters in English, but we've actually got quite a bit larger number of unique sounds that we use. One way to describe those is in terms of what's called a phone, P-H-O-N-E. And that is described simply as the smallest distinguishable unit of all possible human speech sounds that could be made. Okay? No one language uses all of them. There may be as many as 80, there are at least as many as 85 that are used by some languages, such as Hawaiian. So they have, not Hawaiian. Hawaiian is the other example. But languages that have up to 85 sounds on which they're based tend to have very short words as a consequence, because they've got a lot of different sounds they can draw from. On the other hand, Hawaiian uses only about 15 sounds. And so Hawaiian has many much longer words because in order to get a unique identifier for all the different things in the world that we have to identify, they have to string together a larger number of sound units. Now, the English normally uses about 42 to 45 of those. And in essence, what we're going to describe that in terms of is what is known as a phoneme. And a phoneme is basically the basic speech unit of a spoken language, which can be distinguished by how it is produced, meaning whether it's voiced or unvoiced, plosive, or what we'll call fricative, and demonstrate for you here in a couple of minutes. But a phoneme is basically the basic speech unit of a spoken language. It's the sounds on which, the smallest unit of speech sound, that can be used to distinguish one meaningful utterance from another in any given language, called phonemes. Those are utilized basically in terms of our language, in terms of the vowels and so forth. But let me just, in terms of that, we have only 6 vowels that are used. Y is a kind of a split. Sometimes it is a vowel, sometimes it isn't. And so in essence, we've got all of those vowel sounds are open-throated. They're produced without any hindrance at all. We just shape the mouth differently. The contrast, then, is consonants. In the consonants, of which, as you're aware, we have quite a number, those are actually produced by various ways of restricting, or in some cases even blocking, the airflow past our vocal cords and out of our mouth. So each phoneme in the language is represented by a single symbol, which can be studied in a couple of different ways. That is, one of the ways in which we study it is to talk about what is called phonemics, which is basically the study of the particular phonemes of a language. That is, when you're focusing just on the phonemes of the language and the way in which those are used, that would be the study of phonemics, or phonemics is the description of what you're doing there. The other way to look at it is to look at it in terms of actual production. And then what you're looking at is what's called, or the technique that is utilized, is phonetics. And in phonetics, what we're doing is studying how to produce or combine speech sounds or to represent them with written symbols. We've got both problems, output in terms of whether we're speaking or whether we're writing. The phonemes are specifically related to sound production. But there are certain strictures also in terms of how we can write in particular ways. So each phoneme is basically represented by a single symbol, as I started to say here before. And I think I may have shown you this once before, but this is the International Phonetic Alphabet, also known as the IPA. And in that situation, there are a whole series of symbols, a limited number of which I've illustrated for you there. That NJ signal or sign, symbol, it's the word I'm looking for there, is the sound that you use in wrong or anger or ringing. It actually is used twice there. So the NJ symbol is the ng sound. The tipped over S is sh, as in shed or ash. And then we've got an interesting illustration here of two different ways in which the mouth is shaped identically, but produces different sounds. TH as in thin or tooth is not vocalized. It's breathy, and it's coming out between your teeth and your tongue. But it sounds differently than if you're saying TH as in then or breathe, because in that case, the mouth is held almost identically, but the difference is that the vocal cords are vibrating. So it's the difference between and and if you feel your vocal, it tickles your lips to do the sound for very long. But the difference there is that your vocal cords are vibrating in the second sound, the second phoneme, and since it produces a different sound, it's identified by a different phonemic symbol, because it is in fact a different phoneme. It's a different sound when it's used in a word. So each phoneme is represented, each sound that we can produce, and not that we can produce, that we do produce in English, is represented by a different phoneme. But the International Phonetic Alphabet, a phonemic symbol, I should say, in the International Phonetic Alphabet, all 82 or 85 or 90 of the sounds that can be produced by the human tongue and mouth are represented by a symbol. So the IPA is actually an alphabet, in quotes, of some 85 or 90 symbols, each of which represents the many different sounds that we can produce. English, as it turns out, uses about half of them to produce the entirety of the English vocabulary. So each phoneme is represented by one of those symbols, and it's produced by a complex coordination of our lungs when we pressure, when we don't, the vocal cavities, our mouth particularly, but also to a certain extent our nasal cavity is drawn in to produce certain kinds of sounds. Our larynx, the lips, the tongue, and the teeth are all involved in the production of various kinds of sounds. Our vocal cords, as you may be aware, are basically two membranes that are stretched very tightly across our throat, and they vibrate due to the passage of air across them as air is coming up our windpipe out of our lungs. And the result then is various kinds of sounds. And so in essence, as I said, the vowel sounds are basically produced simply by an open mouth. And you can practice it yourself. When you say A, E, I, O, or U, the only difference is how your mouth is shaped. But in every case, it's open flow of the air past or through your mouth when it is open but shaped slightly differently to allow us to sign to each other or signal to each other A or I and so forth. The mouth is open in every instance in that situation. Not so with the consonants. When we're producing consonants, there are actually several different features of our mouth that can be used in that situation. Lips are what are involved, for instance, in F as opposed to V. Okay, F and V are produced primarily by our lips, although they are also, in one case, voiced and in the other case, not voiced. I'll talk about that in a minute. The second are the 5 sounds, the 5 letters and associated sounds that can be produced when we block our lips momentarily and we interrupt the airflow. B, D, not necessarily, I should say block the airflow. It's not always the lips that do it, but B, P are the only two that actually involve lip blockage and then release of the air. So you get a minor explosion of air out of the mouth, as I'll show you here in a minute. But in essence, those are, in every case, plosive sounds. That is, you cannot say the sound of B and hold it. Your head would explode, because the nature of B as a sound is in a momentary block and then release air out of a mouth shaped in a particular way. B and P are very similar, but the mouth actually is shaped differently. In one case, you're blocking the air and then releasing it, which is true of B, D, K, P, and T. All 5 of those involve blocking the air and then releasing it. The fact that we block it means that we can't hold that sound, because the very nature of the phoneme is a blockage and then release of air, very momentary. We also use our nasal cavity, as I said earlier, to distinguish between and n. Okay, that's vibration that includes the nasal cavity when we're using either of those particular phonemes. And then finally, we've got the difference between voiced and non-voiced sounds or phonemes. F and V, if you think about it, shape the mouth in exactly the same way. Whether you're saying F or V, you shape the mouth identically. And the difference is, in one case your vocal cords are vibrating, and in the other case they're not. S and Z are the same way. You actually move your tongue and lips, mouth, through the same sequence in saying S as opposed to Z. The difference is that with Z, the vocal cords are actually vibrating as you're doing the same thing that you would do shaping or saying the letter S. And so basically all of these different movements and blockages and shapings of the airflow gives us the consonant experience that we are able to produce. Now let me just, Robert Sternberg in one of his books had a very interesting demonstration of what I'm talking about. Pronounce for yourself the following sentence. Put the paper cup to your lip. And then what I want you to do, after pronouncing that sentence, is put your hand up about an inch in front of your mouth and feel what actually happens as you're saying, put the paper cup to your lip. Okay? What you'll feel there is the difference between two different types of phonemes. Okay? In one case, what we have here, put and paper, actually involve the phoneme, which is different from, okay? The difference here is this, and that is that cup and lip actually involve the phoneme. And you'll notice that you experience a different, or you can see it if you just hold a Kleenex in front of somebody else and ask them to say that sentence, put the paper cup to your lip. And you'll find that there is a puffing of the Kleenex bounces outward when there is an air release on one of the pairs and not on the other, indicating that the PH phoneme there is different in terms of how you actually produce it, as opposed to the P in cup and lip. And that just illustrates the subtleties of the linguistic sounds that we utilize in talking. And then, in fact, we have another demonstration, a different way to look at this, in terms of what is called a spectrograph. This is where you begin to get a very sophisticated analysis of the physiology of what's going on and how we are actually communicating with each other. What I'm talking about here is what's called a spectrograph. In the spectrograph, what we're going to do, in fact, I'll just go ahead and put it on the screen here because we're going to run a demonstration for you here in a minute. But basically, on this graph, what we're going to show you here is the occurrence of what sound frequencies occur as a function of the time at which they are offered. So if we were to actually have somebody say into the microphone, to catch pink salmon, what we would find is this kind of a sound representation. That is, you see that there is a great deal of sound about 0.2 of a second after you start the phrase, to catch pink salmon, which takes a little bit more than a second for us to say at a normal rate of speech. And what we're plotting there then is the time on the x-axis and when particular frequencies are present at the y-axis. You can appreciate, of course, that we had to have computers in order to actually do this kind of a presentation. But if you'll look at this, you'll notice that do you see a particular frequency there that is widely represented? That is up and down the screen there. There is one frequency that is particularly frequently represented. About what is it? About what frequency?
38.
Yeah. Somewhere around this level, there is a very pronounced presence of that particular frequency. Okay? It turns out, if you look closely, there's a second one. Down around here. That you'll notice that band also tends to be represented quite frequently in the diagram there, and there's a third one, much lower. All of these are what are referred to as formants. Each of those is a formant, F-O-R-M-A-N-T. And it turns out these are very critically involved in how you and I are able to speak to one another. Because in essence, if we could actually mimic the graph that we've got on the board there, if we had a computer that would simply sound a beep at about, for this speaker, 3,500 cycles per second, another beep at around 2,400, and a third beep around 700. That 7 to 24 to 35 ratio, it turns out, is a constant in all of the language that you and I use in speaking to one another, and I'm talking particularly here about speaking, but when we speak to one another, those formants for that particular speaker are always there. So that's a within subjects feature. That is, that's the formants that are there for that particular speaker. What makes this particularly valuable, however, is that if we look at your speech, we would find formants in there also. In fact, we would find 3 formants. In fact, we would find them in the ratio of approximately 7 to 24 to 35. If you have a lower voice, those formants will be compressed toward the bottom of the screen. If you have a higher voice, those will be expanded toward the rarefied atmosphere at the top of the screen. But that is, in fact, why it was so difficult for us originally to hear or to engage in machine translation of language. You may remember that, for a long time, the best you could do on a computerized phone answering system was a very constricted yes or no or something like that. That they could pretty well tell it, probably as much as anything else, as the latency of how long it takes you to say it. But in fact, the difficulty that we had was that playing somebody who has a very low voice, and I'm going to give you a sample of that in just a minute, all 3 of those formants may be compressed so low that if you then listen to a soprano saying the same thing, the lowest of his or her formants might be above the highest of the bass voice person. Let's listen to a sample here. I had Chuck Scott, one of the announcers at KUHF here on campus. He has a magnificent, very deep bass voice. And if you want to hear it live, go on any Saturday night. He's on right after Garrison Keillor's Prairie Home Companion. But let's listen to about a 30-second sample of Chuck Scott speaking.
The Gatlin brothers are touring again following a 10-year hiatus. Larry, Steve, and Rudy started in Texas dance halls 40 years ago and would later play at the White House and on Broadway. The show is Saturday night, January 27th at 7 at Williams Trace Baptist Church, 16755 Southwest Freeway at the Sweetwater exit in Sugar Land. For tickets, call 281-275-65.
Okay, so when you listen to him, his voice is so deep he could almost swallow himself. If you have nice bass speakers, turn them up when he's talking. It is just an incredibly rich, very low voice. I can't even get down as low as he does, and it's obvious I'm straining to do it. But if we were to plot his formants on the curves that we were showing you a minute ago, they would be very compressed down at the bottom. On the other hand, if we had a soprano, I didn't have time to identify somebody in class to let them talk here, but if we imagine, I think if I remember, Madonna has a fairly high voice, doesn't she? So if we were to have Madonna give essentially the same public service announcement that Mr. Scott was just doing there, we would find that her formants are spread much further up. But interestingly, the ratio of the top to the middle to the bottom is essentially identical. If we go back to the screen a minute then, that ratio of first to second to third formant is a constant. If we actually had a computer that would only sound at 3500 for this particular speaker when 3500 is represented there, so we'd listen to, beep, 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 and so forth. If you actually put those 3 frequencies together in the ratio of the 35 to 24 to 700, what you would find is that you could introduce that to people as computer music, and they would listen to it that way and enjoy it. But if you tell them, wait a minute, if you listen closely, you can hear language. It is then possible to listen just to those 3 frequencies and hear the spoken word. That is, you can actually hear the message that is intoned in that situation. And if we adjust the ratio down or up, the ability to do that is still there. It's just the difference between listening to somebody with a bass voice as opposed to listening to a soprano voice. Okay? No difference. Therein was the secret as to why we needed computers to do the machine translation of language. You had a question or comment?
Yes. Are those anomalies due to the octaves of the range in which you're speaking? Like when you speak a tone, there's a harmonic that goes above and below whenever you speak something like that. Is that due to that? Is that why you see it? Because it's the same ratio on every step. If you go up and down, is that a nature of our vocal cords and a harmonic resonant type deal, or what is that?
That's a very complex question to answer, half of which is in sensory processes and perception. If I understand the question you're asking, the basic answer is yes. That is, the chamber that any of us have, the size of the mouth, the shape of the nasal cavity, and so forth, does tend to produce unique overtones. When you and I speak on the phone, or are spoken to on the phone, we know immediately who we're talking to, even though they may not say much more than hi or hello. And yes, the harmonics that are involved are also involved there. But that's really what adds nuances in the same way that there's a difference between a violin and a piano playing a particular tone. That's what you're really identifying as kind of a depth feature in terms of what we were looking at there in just 2 dimensions. And the primary thing I was talking about, the analogy, I guess, would be a chord where the ratio of the first to the second to the third tone is consistent. The resonances that go with it as a function of the speaking chamber could be altered or would be altered as a function of whether you were speaking or somebody else in the room or me was speaking. Yes. Okay. Let me then point out that in essence when we look at the spectrographs we find a couple of different things, and I've essentially made this, but I wanted to make sure you understood the point, and that is that for a low voice, what you have are very compressed formants. They're compressed into just a limited number of frequencies. With a high voice, you have a more rarefied or expanded array of formants. Same ratio, first to second to third, but they're spread out more on the frequencies that we are sensitive to. And the ratio of the low to the medium to the high is essentially a constant. Now, in essence, your stereo has a crossover filter in it. And what that filter does is to separate out high and low frequencies, and then it feeds them to the woofer if it's the low frequencies, and to the tweeters if it's the high notes or the high frequencies that are involved there. The same technology is actually utilized in analyzing speech. That is, sounds, analyzing speech sounds over time. Output from each filter then is recorded on moving paper. And what it allows us to do is to produce the kind of visual analysis that we were just looking at there. And it depicts it it depicts the form of each specific phoneme, which is essentially the production of a voice print. In other words, what do the frequencies look like when a given speaker says A, E, I, H, L, and so forth and so on. Accurate study of the acoustic properties of speech show that those properties vary over time. But in normal children, hearing speech serves as a model. That is, the child actually models what they are listening to, what they're hearing in their environment. And so you and I are very good at mimicking one another, and we tend to do so. My ex-wife has a phenomenally good voice for mimicking people anyway. But the funny thing was, and what I used to tease her about occasionally, was that if she got into an environment where there were a lot of people speaking a southern accent, which is a very rich, melodic kind of use of, and I'm not talking about East Tennessee twang, I'm talking about deep South, good, solid accent, she would end up mimicking them. And she'd get in the car afterwards and speak to me about y'all and much more slow and the drawl and the whole 9 yards of that very interesting inflection of English. But in deaf children, the feedback is missing. However, if they can then be put with a microphone that will generate this kind of spectrograph, what we can do then is to allow them to learn to shape their voice. That is, they can see a depiction of the frequencies that they're producing over time and can learn to intone in such a way as to make their voice produce a print that matches what's superimposed on the screen. So that in essence, the technology has a number of different uses, not only in terms of increasing our understanding about how to computer analyze words, but even as a teaching vehicle for children that have not heard their language, in fact, who have to see it in order to be able to actually speak it. So in essence now at this point we're going to shift into another whole area, and that is to look at what are called morphemes. Morphemes basically are defined simply as units of meaning. A morpheme is essentially the smallest unit of single or combined sounds that denotes meaning in a language. For instance, it could be illustrated by something like a prefix or a suffix, and it can be combined with other morphemes to form words. So a morpheme is a meaning unit, and can then be added to or combined to produce particular kinds of meaning, or add to the meaning of a core word of some sort. Two other variations that I want to emphasize while we're doing definitions here. The second is what's called content morpheme. These are essentially words that convey the primary meaning of a concept. It's also sometimes called the root word. What is the base word to which we are adding meaning? Anti-disestablishmentarianism is a kind of a playful example of adding on a whole bunch of morphemes to the basic root word in that situation. The other kind of morpheme that we can also talk about is what is called a function morpheme. In a function morpheme, we've got two different things that we can talk about here. One is parts of a word that add detail and nuance to the primary meaning of a content morpheme. Okay, so these are things that nuance or alter, modify slightly the base word's meaning. Or in the other case, we can talk about it as parts of a word that help the content morpheme fit the grammatical context. For instance, a prefix like anti or a suffix like ly, L-Y. The article the or the conjunction and. All of those can be used as function morphemes to aid the linking of the meaning of a given morphemic unit or word to the broader context within which it's occurring. So those content or function morphemes can be composed of words or word parts or prefixes or suffixes or any combination of these. So we can give you some examples of what we're talking about here. Specifically, if we look at things like inflections, okay? Inflections are basically common suffixes that we add to words to fit the grammatical context, all right? And if we take a sentence like the young psychologist hated wistful paintings, we have an example of what I'm talking about here. These two, the and young, are function morphemes in this situation as we've described them, okay? And the other words are basically a combination of free and bound or content morphemes. That is, the green words, psychologist, hated, wistful, and paintings, are a combination of content and, in some cases, free morphemes that are being used in that situation. But they are all modifying the attitude of the psychologist that we're talking about. It was a young psychologist. It was a single psychologist. The attitude that he particularly had and what it was addressed to, and so forth. All of those are various features that impact the nature of the meaning that is conveyed in that particular sentence. For instance, in this case, why did we not, or let me show you here. I forgot that I was going to do this for you. The base word is psychology, but what we've done in this case is to add ist to make it an individual. In the second instance, we've added ed to HAT, the base word hate. We've added ed to make it past tense. We've added ful to whist in order to make it wistful, a nuance on whist. And finally, with painting, we've added an s, which leads to an interesting observation, and that is, why did I not do it this way? Why did I not do it as painting plus ing plus s? Because in essence, what we're talking about there is an actual painting. It's the after product of art. It was not the act or the verb of paint, which we were painting, in which it's not the act of painting, it's the finished product. And so in that case, the fundamental morpheme there, the unit of meaning in that case, is painting, not paint as an act. Okay? So the analysis of morphemes can get to be pretty subtle in some instances. Now, in general, what we're working with here is what's called a lexicon. And what that is, in each of us, is essentially the entire set of morphemes in a given language, which you and I, of course, haven't mastered. But then it can also be referred to as the entire set of morphemes in a particular person's active and passive vocabulary. Those are the morphemes that the lexicon that I have is simply a list of all the words and meanings that I have stored away and can potentially use. You know the difference between active and passive memory. Active memory is the words that we normally use, and it's remarkably limited in most of us. If you listen to people in a telephone conversation, they tend to draw most of their language from about 2,000 words. We don't very often get into big words like lexicon, the meaning of which you now know, but that's probably going to be in your passive vocabulary. Yes, you know the meaning of it, and if you later stumble across it in your reading, you'll understand the meaning of lexicon, but lexicon is probably not at the top of the words that you will list when talking about vocabulary, which is the word you're probably much more likely to talk about, or meanings, or word meanings. It all means essentially the same thing. But the passive vocabulary is what we can recognize as opposed to what we'll actually recall and use in a given situation. And so then let's look at study and the ways in which that can be modified. Okay? Various kinds of morphemes that can be associated with study. If we add ENT, we end up with student. If we add IOUS, we end up with studious. If we add IED, we end up with a past tense studied, something you've done previously. If we add ING, we've turned it into an act that you're engaged in right now. And finally then, we can also add IES to make it a more generic kind of activity, studies that you're involved in. The average adult, you and I, have probably 80,000 morphemes, but those things can be combined to produce a vocabulary of hundreds of thousands of different morphemic units. That is, you and I can string together. Think about the word snow, which has been the object of debate by psycholinguists over the years. You and I have only one word for snow. It is alleged that Alaskans, certain kinds of native tribes in Alaska, have 8 or 10 or 12 different words or meanings associated with snow. The reason being that snow is a lot more important to them than it is to us. Yeah, it'll bring our commerce to a stop if it ever happens here in Houston. But in Alaska, it's a given, so you have to work around it. And thus, they are interested in things like, is it a wet snow or not? The kids want to know particularly, is it a wet snow? Because if it is, you can make a nice, good snowball out of it and heave it at somebody. If it's a dry snow, you pack it all up and it'll fall apart. It will not adhere. But the Eskimos, Indians, need a lot more information about snow than you and I do, so they have identified a lot more morphemes to uniquely identify the particular type of snow that they're talking about. Yet for you and I, that's why we have adjectives. We can talk about, I've already done it in describing it here. Wet snow, fluffy snow, light snow, blowing snow. There are separate words in certain Indian tribes, Native American tribes in Alaska to identify each of those. But this production is tightly governed by rules. That is, we have a very specific set of rules in English as to how we convert a base word into the unique meaning that we're trying to do or convey in a particular situation. There are very specific rules about what can and what cannot follow particular elements of the language. Syllables, for instance, cannot start a word if there are more than 3 in a row. I'm misspeaking there. Consonants is the word I meant to use. You cannot start an English word with more than 3 consonants in a row. Okay? Because we need some vowels in there in order to give our mouth the ability to form the syllables that we use to talk to one another. Okay? Q cannot be followed by D. J cannot be followed by Z. Those are morphemic rules, essentially. They're rules that dictate, given the way we pronounce J as opposed to Z, that there's simply no way to get between the two of them from one to the other without coming to a complete stop. They cannot be next to each other in a message. These rules, combined with language's natural redundancy, work basically to reduce the likelihood that you and I will have communication errors. That is, we understand the rules of English. And in fact, I gave you the phonemic example several weeks ago, several tapes ago, of G-H-O-T-I pronounced fish. And what I was doing in that case was starting with G-H in a way that it never starts a word that is going to be enunciated. And yet G-H does appear at the end of words like rough and tough and enough, and then it's perfectly legal. And in the context, we could have much more easily, you would have been much more likely to eventually figure out the meaning if GH had been at the end of the particular example word that I used. But what I was doing there was violating one of the implicitly understood rules about English, and that is that if GH is at the beginning, it's going to be a hard pronunciation, as in ghetto. Okay, it's a G rather than F. Okay? Now, let's move in yet another direction in terms of our understanding of what we're talking about here in language, and that is look now at order effects, the specific rules that we use in producing English, and there are numerous ones that we can cover here. Syntax. Up to this point, all we've been studying is semantics, that is the meaning that we convey through the various words and how we string them together and organize them and so forth. Words and morphemes have been the primary source of our study here, in addition to the phonemes of which the words and morphemes are constituted. The next level of analysis, thinking of the hierarchy that we mentioned earlier, is going to switch us now to looking at linguistic structure. And that puts us right into the context of syntax. Syntax is not something that a government collects, okay, in this context. It is, rather, the pattern by which users of a particular language put words together to form sentences, okay? That is syntax as I'm going to use it here. We also sometimes will refer to it simply as the rules which govern the combination of phonemes into higher linguistic units, namely phrases or sentences. So the rules of syntax are going to govern how we string words together to form a longer unit of communication, and they're used simply in focusing our study on grammar of phrases and sentences. There are a very specific series of rules that are utilized in this particular situation. To give you an example, and coming back to something we talked about way back on day one, I want to go back and remind you of an example of a paleontologist that we talk about in this situation. In essence, what we're saying here is that a paleontologist starts with the bones and uses his or her knowledge of things like muscle structure and function, how big the muscles have to be in order to perform a particular operation, the ratio of muscle size to the task that is to be performed by a particular part of the body where it's attached. Secondly, things like the distribution of hair and function in terms of what that tells us about where an animal or which way a particular element of a skeleton is likely to move. And then various things like skin structure and function. And we use all that knowledge to create essentially an image of an organism that humans have never seen, which is a saber-toothed tiger. We have, from the various knowledge that we have accumulated, been able to do a pretty good job of constructing a fairly consistent model of what saber-toothed tigers look like. And yet saber-toothed tigers had been wiped off the face of the earth before the first human ever came onto the earth. So in that case, what the paleontologist is doing is starting with the nuggets and building up to a model of what the whole structure probably looked like. Best guess. Psycholinguists do the exact opposite in one sense when they're dealing with a sentence. What they do is basically start with the finished structure and uttered sentence. And they use, for instance, knowledge of language structure as one element of what we're analyzing. They use rules of grammar and syntax as a second element of what's being analyzed. And they look at semantics and phonology in order to describe the cognitive mechanism that could generate the completed sentence. So in essence, what they're doing is they start with the finished product, the sentence, and they then try to break it out into its constituent elements. So the psycholinguist, I'm going to argue, does exactly the opposite of what a paleontologist does. And you may remember way back on one of the earliest tapes, I mentioned the idea that a paleontologist, or I should say a psycholinguist and an English teacher, are different in the way in which they're using the grammar, the rules of syntax. And let me show you what I'm talking about there. In essence, one of the ways we can talk about grammar is to talk about what is called prescriptive grammar. That is the correct way, in quotes, to structure written and spoken language. Okay? That's the kind of language or the kind of grammar that English teachers were teaching to you and me, or trying to, in middle school and high school. They were very concerned with sentence order, where to put the comma, when to put a comma, whether to have a comma, when to put an apostrophe and when not. I was reading the other day about an error that I had found myself starting to make, and that is the pronoun its, its, when it is in the possessive, that is, it belongs to or is a feature of an inanimate object, does not have an apostrophe. It is simply its. That's a very common grammatical error that you will find in student essays when you're reading them here at the U of H, and we all have done that at various times. But when you're talking about something that is a feature of the television's squareness, its squareness in that context is not it apostrophe s squareness. It is rather the monitor's a feature of the monitor, and so in that case, its is the correct word to use, no apostrophe. That is an element, a rule, if you will, that comes right out of prescriptive grammar. That is what English teachers are trying to do for us. Question, comment?
Is cadence also a function of what you're talking, of what you're describing, the manner in which the rhythm in which you speak?
You're more dealing there with what would be the technically correct word? What you're after essentially is the phonemic analysis of how you're trying to produce the word. There are about 7 different ways to answer that question. One of the ways to point out is that certainly what we're dealing with in that situation is more tradition. I was mentioning earlier Southern drawl as the descriptor that's often used for somebody who's got a really deep South English-speaking accent in speaking English. That really is where cadence comes in more so than in specific English. The only other thing that would well, as I'm talking to an answer, the other thing to point out would be that when I showed you the IPA earlier, I did not point out what we talked about earlier in one of the earlier tapes, and that is the IPA actually conveys 3 different things to a speaker. One is the actual sounds that are to be produced. What's the sequence of sounds? But a second feature is the emphasis. Which of the syllables is to be stressed? The same thing they do with bold and when you're seeing a word in a dictionary or italics. But the third, and the answer to your question, is cadence. That is, what they're looking at is the spacing between the particular phonemes that are indicated there indicates where the lag is to be in speaking a particular language. So yes, that is part of it, although it's not a formal part, in the sense that, as I started to say earlier, when we were talking about parsing or diagramming sentences, an English teacher is using it prescriptively, exactly as we've just defined prescriptive grammar. A psycholinguist, I should say, is using it descriptively, which puts us into the other definition that I want to give you here at this point, and that is, in addition to prescriptive grammar, we also have what is known as descriptive grammar, which is essentially the analysis of the structures, functions, and relationships of words in public or performed language. That is what a psycholinguist is primarily interested in. So in one sense, basically, what psycholinguists are doing is differentiating between the two. That is, they are more interested in essentially describing what kind of a mechanism has produced or led to the particular enunciation pattern that we have heard. What has produced whatever sentence has been created in that particular situation. Okay? Differentiating between the two, Steven Pinker, who is a magnificent writer on these kinds of issues, if you can get one of Pinker's books, his 1994 book is particularly good with interesting, quirky linguistic examples that provide a distinction between prescriptive as opposed to descriptive grammar. Consider the following statement made by a child to his father. Papa, why did you bring that book that I don't want to be read to out of up for? Papa, why did you bring that book that I don't want to be read to out of up for? Which is correct. It's just that all of the wrong word class have been stacked at the end of a sentence. Okay, that's not good English. Okay, it doesn't follow the prescriptive rules of where the various modifiers need to be in a particular sentence. The particular difficulty there, to draw back to something we talked about earlier, is the load on short-term memory. Because in order to get the last part of the sentence, to out of up for, you have to sprinkle those back through each of the other major thoughts that have been in that sentence, which means you've got to hold the whole thing in memory and then re-inject each of the features there, which is just not the way our memory is set up to operate, and that's the reason we don't speak English in that particular order. But the analysis of syntax has basically been extended to include the manner in which sentences can be transformed from one form to another. Let's look at a couple of examples of this to show you what I'm talking about. People show a remarkable understanding of syntax, and it plays a number of roles in the way in which we analyze language. And if we can go to the screen for a minute, what we're going to do here now is look at specifically a problem of analyzing our use of syntax. One of the things that syntax and the rules of syntax are good at helping us with is to understand that we can easily identify particular features of language in terms of the syntax. We can identify, for instance, grammatically correct and incorrect sentences. Is it okay to say, colorless green ideas sleep furiously? There's no meaning to that sentence. That is, the individual words do not string together to convey anything meaningful, but the structure of the sentence is perfectly fine. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Chomsky created that to give us some T's to work with. Okay? But in essence, that's an example of a grammatically correct sentence that means nothing, because the words that are in the individual units, in the individual positions, just don't link to anything else in the sentence. We also tend to show, the other one by Lewis Carroll in Jabberwocky was, "'Twas brillig and the slithy tove did gyre and gimble in the wob." Whoa. It's okay, because it was nonsense words that he was using there, but the sentence was fine. "'Twas brillig and the slithy tove did gyre and gimble in the wob." Or wave, if you want to pronounce it that way. So again, grammatically it's okay. It's just that the individual words are meaningless. So although they follow all the right rules with the adjectives where they need to be, the verbs where they're supposed to be, and so forth, it doesn't make sense. And so we can use our grammar, our understanding of syntax, to be able to understand what has been done to us in that situation. A second way in which we can also use grammar is that we can show what is called syntactic priming. We have a greater inclination, for instance, to use passive sentences if we've just heard others using passive sentences. So when people tend to speak in passive sentences, that is the way that we tend to speak back to them. Okay? We tend to model one another. That is a feature that our syntax, our rules of syntax are giving to us. But the effect goes further. We also tend to speak at the level of sophistication to which we are spoken. I'm not saying that correctly. When you're talking to a 4-year-old, you tend to use 4-year-old language. And that is an ability that we master very early on. If a 4-year-old talks to a 3-year-old, the 4-year-old will simplify his or her language. That is, we learn very early on the importance of syntax in communicating with one another. And so if a youngster, an infant, doesn't yet have complex sentence structure, a 4-year-old is smart enough not to use complex sentences when talking to somebody that's younger that doesn't have that ability mastered yet. We tend to mimic one another. As you go out and walk around later today, I think I may have commented on this once before because it's such a transient, ever-present phenomenon, and that is that we tend to mimic one another very effectively because it minimizes language processing. Yeah, it goes through the filter to make sure we haven't been cussed at. But beyond that, when you're passing somebody on the sidewalk that you know, maybe even just casually, if you say good morning or good afternoon or good evening, that's very likely what you're going to get back at you, even though that person may never say good evening to people. Normally he says hi or hello or whatever. But if you say hello to people, they tend to say hello to you. If you say good day, they tend to say good day, and so forth. It's an efficiency matter. Because if it's acceptable, if it gets past our acceptability filter, we'll go ahead and just feed it back to the individual. We know they're going to understand it, and it doesn't require any active linguistic processing on our part to take the term, translate it into our phrase, and put it out again. So that, again, is syntax rule that is governing here what's involved. In addition, then, even our speech errors seem to process or to be processed so as to assure that we have produced something that is proper syntax. So even when we make word errors, the syntax in which we do so tends to be correct. So we might slip and say something like, "The fruits are in the banana basket," when what we meant to say was, "The bananas are in the fruit basket." Okay? So we've substituted fruit and banana. We've exchanged fruit and banana. But you'll notice that what happened there was we pluralized the word that should be pluralized. Because the storage place is a single instant, although there were multiple pieces of fruit in there. So what we tried to say was the bananas, more than one, are in the basket, a single place. And when we made the transposition of meaning, we did not also transport, for instance, we didn't say the fruit are in the bananas basket. That's not the kind of error that you would hear. You'd be much more likely to hear the fruits are in the banana basket than you would that and I can't even do it correctly, the fruit are in the bananas basket. Okay? So what I'm saying is that syntax is the overriding feature there. We may switch the words, i.e. the meaning that we've communicated, but we don't tend to screw up the syntax rules that are governing where the pluralization should occur in that situation. So apparently what is being argued there is that the processing of syntax is separate from processing the meaning or meanings of the words that we're utilizing in the particular sentence frame. This area of study was actually originated by Chomsky in his work in this particular area. And in essence, he has introduced a number of very complex but challenging features about the language that we're trying to study here. And so when we start looking at actually generating language as a subfeature here of comprehension, Chomsky introduced two different elements of what linguists have focused on in studying linguistic generation. One of these is productivity. And in essence, what we're talking about is the functionally infinite number of sentences any of us is feasibly capable of generating. That is, we can take the nuances, the meanings, the morphemes, excuse me, that we have in our active and passive memory, and we can generate a functionally infinite number of sets of meanings. Okay? That has to do with productivity of language. One of the other things that has also been highlighted by Chomsky in his work is the issue of regularity of the language that we're using. It refers to the universal consistency of the manner in which sentences of a specific type are generated by any speaker of a given language. It's not uniquely true of English, although I keep anchoring my examples in that. But that's an example of the regularity of language. When I do a declarative sentence, whether I speak it to you here in Texas or a friend in Antarctica, it doesn't matter. The rules, understanding of how we generate each of those different types of sentences are a universal. That's why we can speak to each other in a particular language. Which is going to put us into the two last major topics we're going to cover in this lecture. We're not going to finish it all today. I can see that from the old clock on the wall already. But in essence, one of the two things we're going to spend some time looking at is what is called phrase structure grammar. We define that essentially as rules governing language regularity, as I was just talking about that. Okay? Rules governing language regularity has to do with what is called phrase structure grammar. That grammar dictates, for instance, sentence construction or structure, which is often analyzed, as I said earlier, using tree diagrams to reveal the interrelationships between the various syntactic classes that are reflected there. That is, what we're trying to do is relate the syntax to the phrase structure that has been used in a particular sentence. And what it does, basically, is to reveal that sentences are not just strings, but rather they're clusters or substructures of words organized within the sentence structure. That is, what we've got are subunits, structures within the rules governing how a particular sentence is generated. That was one of the important contributions of Chomsky's work and the work that was generated out of his seminal writings starting in the 50s and proceeding through the last half of the 20th century. So it reveals, as I said, the cluster nature of the components of individual sentences. And basically to create a tree diagram for a sentence, what we need to have is a set of rules. And so I'm going to show you two ways in which we can break down the phrase structure grammar. We start with certain components, certain kind of base elements that we define here. One list of such a structure or list of components would include the following as an example. We would define a subject in any sentence as a noun, a pronoun, or a noun phrase, which I'll define for you here in a minute. NP is the abbreviation for noun phrase. We also then would define predicate, verb, essentially as a verb or a verb phrase, VP, which I'll also define for you here shortly. A noun phrase, I said I would define it, is essentially a determiner plus a noun. That's one way in which to do a noun phrase, although there are others. A verb phrase can be done simply as a combination of a verb plus a noun phrase. Yet another rule. So what we're doing here is building the fundamental rules of English, and you'll be amazed how brief they are for how complex the language is that we can produce, because what we've already gotten to is a certain amount of redundancy. When we include something like noun phrase can go back and be constituted of a determiner plus a noun, so we can expand these two words into three in a sentence immediately, and it keeps going in that way. A determiner, then, we anchor to the vocabulary, a, an, the, and various other kinds of words of that general class. Okay? Again, nouns, and we can go, that's what the dictionary is. Basically, it's a collection of nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, in addition to the other word classes. Well, we've got a zillion examples of those. The vocabulary of English is constituted largely of nouns, not exclusively, but largely. We can then give particular exemplars of verbs. And I think you can see that we could go ahead and have an adjective list, an adverb list, a pronoun list, and so forth. Okay? Conjunctions. But that's a general way in which we begin to anchor the elements. Now let's combine them. Let's use those to generate particular kinds of sentences. So for instance, what we would have, we start for a declarative sentence with a very simple thing like subject equals noun phrase plus verb phrase. S equals NP plus VP. And in essence, then, we've got noun phrase or NP equals determiner plus noun. Some of this is repeated from the previous list, for which I apologize. But here's another way we can do a verb phrase. It can be, for instance, a verb plus a prepositional phrase, which we've now defined as PP, which will appear in the rule system here. Again, a verb phrase can be a verb phrase plus a noun phrase. A verb plus a noun phrase. We've just indicated that a noun phrase can be a determiner plus a noun, so we could have a verb phrase be verb plus determiner plus noun, and so forth. We can also add a second prepositional phrase. So we could have verb plus prepositional phrase as our verb phrase in the overall sentence. Sentence equals noun phrase plus verb phrase. We've now just doubled the possible length of the verb phrase using this redundant and additory rule system. And then we can define prepositional phrase as, for instance, verb plus two prepositional phrases. Or we can define it as preposition plus a noun phrase. I won't go on, but the implication of what I'm doing there is pretty obvious. And in fact, then, what we're going to do is take that rule system and put it directly into a network. That is, we're going to look at how the sentences then can be generated. Okay? So we're going to apply the rules by diagramming or parsing a sentence. And we start with this. The girl looked at the boy with the telescope. And what I've scoped in above it there is an actual breakdown to show you the rules that were utilized to generate that particular sentence. And you can see what's involved there, and that is the basic rule as you see. And if you just read down from the top of the diagram, what you're doing is repeating the rules I was just talking about. Subject equals noun phrase plus verb phrase is the very first split that you see on the screen there. We jump to noun phrase and define it, for instance, as determiner plus noun. We could do it as determiner plus adjective plus noun. The worried girl would expand it. Haven't done it here. But the verb phrase now, again, goes through the same redundancy or building opportunity that we had before. And that is verb phrase, one rule is verb phrase plus prepositional phrase, which is what we've got there. At the. Okay? And in turn, a prepositional phrase can be defined as a preposition plus a determiner plus a noun phrase, which is illustrated by at the, preposition, determiner, and then a noun phrase, boy with the telescope. And in fact, the noun phrase then, as we've expanded or could expand our definition, can be defined to be a noun plus a preposition plus a determiner plus another noun, as it is when we look at boy with the telescope, which is a noun phrase by definition. I cite this because this is an ambiguous sentence if you look at it. Do you detect the other meaning? Because in fact, the girl looked at the boy with the telescope can actually be intoned in a different way. So let's leave the sentence, but let's diagram it in a different way. And let me show you one other thing. Well, I'll come back and talk about this because I've got a better example a little bit later here. Okay? Let's leave that sentence and show you this kind of a diagnosis. Now, when we parse it this way, a different meaning is intended here. Because in the other case, boy with the telescope is what the girl was looking at. That was the end object of that particular expression. She was looking at the boy with the telescope. He was standing with or utilizing or had in his possession a telescope. That's what she was looking at. But in this instance, the intended meaning is different. Because now what we've got, same basic rule, the breakdown occurs when we get over to the verb phrase. Because now we're defining the verb phrase as verb plus prepositional phrase plus prepositional phrase. And when we analyze it that way, we see that we've got within the first, at the boy, we have within there the preposition and another noun phrase, determiner plus noun. And in fact, when we look at the last element then, prepositional phrase, in this case it is broken down as preposition plus determiner plus noun with the telescope. That tells us now that the young lady, the girl, is standing using a telescope to look at the boy. Okay? The girl looked at the boy with the telescope, is the way you would intone that. You see the difference? The girl looked at let me say it again. The girl looked at the boy with the telescope. Indicates she's standing over here looking at him where he has the telescope. But if I intone it as this system diagnoses it, the girl looked at the boy with the telescope. Okay? That's where we're going backwards in trying to understand. That is what a psycholinguist does, is to start with the girl looked at the boy with the telescope, the ending sentence, and tries to derive how was that derived, try to describe how was that derived. And the difference is quite marked, as you can see there, in terms of what is really intended in that situation. Again, pauses are predicted here, but I'll hold off on describing that because I've got a better example of it a little bit later here. But in essence, when we look at the benefits that diagrams give to us, there are several different examples of the situation here. We talked about some of them, but the one of the things that it does is to show us the interrelationship between the words to one another in the role that the role that they're playing in each of the sentences. That is the role of each word in a particular sentence, and it differs depending on the intended meaning of what the speaker was trying to convey to us. The diagram will indicate that to us if we care, one way or another. But in essence, what these diagrams also do, as I kind of implied by the red lines that I put probably earlier than I should have because it was such a rich example, is that in essence what this structure allows us to do is to predict where pauses will occur, where they will probably occur when we're reading the sentence, depending on the meaning that we assign to it. Let me just start with a very basic sentence and show you what I'm talking about. And that is if we start with the very simple thing, subject, verb, and direct object. The boy likes the girl. Okay? We can diagram this in this way. A simpler analysis of what we were talking about before. But in essence now we have, same rule, subject or sentence equals noun phrase plus verb phrase. The noun phrase in that case is just the boy, determiner plus noun. Where in that whole sentence would you expect to have the largest break or pause? If you listen to somebody saying that sentence, where would you be most comfortable if they paused for a minute? After boy, yes. This is the most obvious break point in the sentence. And the reason is that the load on short-term memory is halved at this point, if you think about it. Because we've got a bunch of rules we could have strung together. Unfortunately, all of my examples include a much longer verb phrase. Well, we could have just as easily strung together a series of words describing the boy. The tall, handsome, just flunked out of school boy. And so forth. Okay? That would have extended the noun phrase. But in this particular declarative sentence, once you finish in this diagram with boy, you're done with all the rules concerning noun phrase. You don't have to worry about those rules any longer. And so what happens is your mind, in processing this, literally switches gears. It changes rules, because now all it's concerned about is the verb phrase rules. Okay? And in this case, it breaks down in this very simplistic sentence into verb phrase equals verb plus noun phrase. So we might logically expect a second pause where? After what word? Yeah, likes. It would not be unusual to see a break in that situation. Again, think of the cognitive load. In that particular sentence, you're now done with half of the verb phrase rule. All you've got to do is crank out one more noun phrase or extended noun phrase. And again, it would not, it wouldn't surprise you at all if I said something like the boy long pause, likes the girl. It wouldn't be too uncomfortable if I said the boy likes, long pause, the girl. A little more awkward because the phrase, the break really doesn't belong there cognitively in terms of what we're still processing. But what would you do if I said to you, the boy likes the girl? There is just no goofy reason to have the pause after the in that diagram. Okay? Assuming that diagram is an accurate representation of what the person intended, there's no processing to do. Once you've reached the determiner in your final noun phrase, you're simply going to say the girl. That's all that's going to be involved there. So the point is that the purpose of this processing is basically to allow us to understand how can somebody use the rule system, or what were they thinking when they generated this sentence, the Dr. Phil question. What were you thinking? That is the reason we get into psycholinguistics, basically. Now, we have one other benefit then, and that is that things like fumbles and pauses can be also predicted by sentences. That is, the fumbles and pauses that we go through in a longer sentence are much more likely to occur at a phrase boundary than mid-phrase anywhere in the sentence. So where I had the red lines on the last sentence, other than the last one, are the places where we're most likely to expect either pauses or maybe even a screw-up. In the example I used earlier with the bananas in the fruit basket, what happened there was a particular set of nouns were exchanged, but the structure of the sentence was diagrammed in exactly the same way. Wrong word, but they were in the right, the syntactic structure of the sentence was unencumbered in that situation. Now let me get into one more thing, and I'm not sure whether we're going to have time to get through all this because this one is a little complex. But what it has to do with then is another thing that Chomsky introduced in terms of the various ways in which we try to study the meaning of individual sentences. And what he's essentially proposing here is that his contribution was basically to really broaden the focus of psycholinguistics, to emphasize not just within sentence relations, which is one of the things he was stressing, but also to look at between sentence relationships, that is, the syntactic relationships that link one sentence to the next in a particular sequence or discourse of combining of sentences into a lengthy exchange of meaning between you and I when we do so. Sentences with very similar meanings may have very different diagrams, and there's the problem. Okay? We, in some cases, in some instances, we will have two sentences that have the same meaning, but very different structure. I'm going to rush through this because there's a lot packed into the next couple of minutes, but I'll come back and review it at the beginning of the next tape. And in essence, let's start with a sentence like, Randy eagerly swallowed the python. Hey, why not? It was chomped up in little bits, so not a problem. We could diagram this in the following way, okay? And that follows the rules that we've looked at earlier. So this is sentence 1, S1, as I'm going to show it to you here. Randy eagerly swallowed the python. The two sentences, and let me give you the second one, show very little similarity when we examine their phrase structure, but their meaning is essentially identical. So let me show you another sentence now. In this case, the python was swallowed eagerly by Randy. That is essentially the same meaning. But look at what it takes to diagram. I mean, at the bottom is the other sentence we were working with. Look at what we have to do to diagram this sentence. We've still got the basic division, noun phrase and verb phrase. But look at how much more protracted or extended the verb phrase is in this situation, and yet it's exactly the same thought. The python was swallowed eagerly by Randy. The net effect of the python is exactly the same, but look at the difference in sentence structure there. So the sentences show very little similarity when we look at them structurally, but their meanings were essentially identical. The only difference there is what? There's one major difference between the two sentences there that I showed you. Let me see if I can back it up without destroying what's there. The main difference is that the bottom sentence is active case. The second sentence, the upper sentence, the second one that we looked at, is passive case. Okay? So all we've done is shifted from active to passive. But as I said, the impact on the snake is exactly the same in both situations. Okay? And so essentially, that's what we get. Much more complex diagram in that situation. Let me show you another problem, and I'll have no time other than to present the problem here. Well, in fact, I won't even do it. I won't burden you with it right now, but I'll well, I will. The hell with it. We're going to show you the same structure with a very different meaning. And in this case, we end up with the following kind of a thing. The first sentence will be, the python eagerly swallowed Randy. And this is the sentence structure that we get here. But now let's switch that around. Randy was swallowed eagerly by the python. Look at how much more complex the sentence structure is there. And the problem that we've got in this situation, again, is that the sentences have very similar meanings, but very different tree diagrams. In the phrase structure grammar, it shows very little relationship, again, between these third and fourth sentences. And it's the comparison between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and then between 1 and 3 and 2 and 4, that becomes the basis on which we can begin to sort out and identify the problem that we have with sentence diagrams. They're not perfect, as we'll pick up at the beginning of the next tape.